Disaster medicine encompasses all threats, all hazards, whether those events are superstorms like Sandy, bombings like the Boston Marathon, active shooters. Regardless of the threat, the concept is that each of us needs to design a system and support a system that could respond to any one of those threats. So it's flexible. In fact, it's fluid because flexible may be too rigid. So the idea is to go through the disaster cycle and empower your team and train and prepare your team so that they can handle each type and navigate each type of scenario regardless of the potential threat. Eric Relnick, Medical Director of Emergency Preparedness at Brigham and Women's Healthcare in Boston, Massachusetts, Assistant Professor of Emergency Medicine at Harvard Medical School. So my role is to serve as the physician liaison for our institution around the preparation, response, recovery, and mitigation for all hazards, all types of disasters that may come our way.
The best way to assess your preparedness activities is through first training on the plans that you have and then exercising those plans. You really can't wait until some event occurs to say, well, our plans worked or our plans didn't. The key to that to success is basing your exercises on measuring your hazards and vulnerabilities. Every hospital and every healthcare provider should have some understanding with the hazards that they face and what vulnerabilities that they have, and analyze that most likely on an annual basis. My name is Barry Wanty. I'm the Director of Emergency Management for Brigham and Women's Health, which includes Brigham and Women's Hospital and Brigham and Women's Partner Hospital and its affiliates. Brigham and Women's Hospital itself has approximately 16,000 employees. Brigham and Women's Partner Hospital is about another 3,000 employees. So we're a rather large organization. We're spread out over approximately 4 million square feet, of which a large percentage of that is clinical space in a metropolitan area of the city of Boston. So that it's certainly an interesting dynamic, Brigham and Women's being an acute care level 1 trauma center. I've been with the organization for just about 10 years, and I've been in the emergency management field for now close to 20 years. But my background started in law enforcement, and I migrated more to the emergency management part of the field over a period of time.
We've learned so much from Sandy, and we've learned so much because of the honesty and integrity of those individuals that were involved in those events. Clinicians, EMS, fire, law enforcement, emergency management have been very good at sharing their after-action reporting with all of us. So when we look at that body of literature and those reports, we see several different themes. One theme is electronic healthcare records. The loss of electronic healthcare records was critical in the challenges of transitioning patients from one facility to another because we had a loss of knowledge of information regarding those patients. Number two is that groups of patients, like patients that need dialysis and patients that need methadone, for several weeks after the event, there were challenges with limited resources, limited locations that can provide dialysis or methadone. Once those clinics were damaged and non-operable, you had multiple individuals that required care at limited places. So it was an issue of scarce resources for many people. So that was a continued challenge during the event and the weeks that followed. Other issues that arose from this event clearly were around transporting patients from one facility to another facility. So actually, there were external parties, EMS parties that came in, and some of the challenges around that were they didn't know the geography of New York, for example, and so there were challenges around navigating back and forth from one hospital to the other. And then subsequently, once you're shutting down several hospitals, you can imagine that the influx of patients that would normally go to emergency departments or those two hospitals or remaining hospitals that were shut down go to the other hospitals that were open. So imagine in your community, if you had several hospitals that were shut down, there would be a massive influx at those other hospitals. Plus, it's complicated by potentially more patients that require care who are stuck in their homes, couldn't see their primary care physician, couldn't go to a clinic. So that required these other hospitals that remained open to be really creative on opening new rooms, new wards, new care locations, while those other hospitals began to build up and open up their centers. Fortunately, with Mother Nature, sometimes we get some warning. For example, Superstorm Sandy, other types of events, blizzards, etc., we will have some lead time. So the advantage with some lead time is to work your plan. And the idea of working your plan is to be able to target and prepare your staff, patients, and families for the eventuality of that storm hitting.
We generally try to do planning where we might have to be standalone for 96 hours. That's sort of a benchmark here in the U.S. Is that it may take up to 96 hours for outside resources to get to you. So can you either scale down the use of power? Can you stretch out your food supplies, or do you have enough on hand to make that 96 hours? Because with the feeling that somewhere prior to 96 hours, the critical infrastructure and the outside support should be able to get to you by that period of time.
So thinking backwards, when you have staff members, for example, that rely on public transportation, that rely on medications for themselves, that rely on childcare issues for their families, you may be able to plan ahead of time. We've actually refined our checklists that we've built based on prior events. So now we've built a checklist, essentially, that is a toolkit for our organization to prepare our staff members and identify staff members that can stay in the hospital overnight. We have a system in place where we can provide bedding, where we can provide meals, where we can provide medications, etc. But we've learned this through experience, and several years ago, we didn't have that toolkit. And each time we try to refine that.
Depending on what the event is, you may have factors of, do we have basic power levels? Most hospitals do. Do you have a backup cache based on your hazard vulnerability analysis? You should. If an outbreak of some sort of infectious disease, you should have some backup caches of some respiratory protection and gowns and gloves and those sorts of material support. So much of the supply chain in the particularly in the United States and frankly worldwide, is just in time. Inventorying is as soon as it comes out of the manufacturer, or if it's an import or an export, as soon as it's off the container on the boats, it's shipped out by truck. The days of the big warehouses where they have 30 days worth of supplies and in any industry is in today's markets are not financially feasible. So it's all just-in-time inventorying. You know, again, whether that's linens for the beds, or pharmaceuticals, or food, or fuel for the generators. Sometimes finding how you're going to do that for 96 hours is not as easy as you may think. As a matter of fact, it's frankly sometimes really difficult.
We should expect of our hospitals that there is a definitive emergency operations plan. That plan is an all hazards plan so that they can operate independently for a distinct amount of time and then have the levers to pull, so predefined arrangements, relationships with institutions so that they can provide extended resources for patients, families, and staff beyond that 96-hour mark.
One of the key tenets to emergency management in the U.S. is the incident command system, and that is something that hospitals use along with public safety agencies, so your police, your fire, your EMS agencies that we interact with on a daily basis, also use the incident command system. So what it is it's a basic organizational structure where you have an incident commander and you have support on the operations side, the planning side, the logistics side, and then the finance and administration side. And it is based off of your common business organizational structure where we have a leader, you have a manageable span of control, and you have an understanding of unity of command, who you report to and who are they reporting to. That's sort of the foundational piece of how we make the big decisions. The incident commander would be ultimately tasked with a decision whether to fully evacuate a hospital or implement any plan that is going to impact the hospital during some sort of a disaster or an emergency. When you're talking about a community, there may be some coordination that has to occur because, obviously when you're talking some of the larger communities, anywhere there's going to be some competing demands for resources. There's going to be competing demands for personnel and also some of the beds. If we all decided we had to evacuate, and God forbid if this would occur, we all had to evacuate all at once, trying to find those beds in a mad dash is not the way you want to do it. So by using the incident command system, that decisions are made of who goes first, when to do it, and through what resources, again, through the community and where those patients are distributed to.
Checklists are a critical tool for emergency management, and as we're seeing in healthcare, they've been utilized in a variety of different scenarios. In emergency management, we've used checklists for what are called job action sheets. And job action sheets are essentially a tool when an individual is assigned a role during a disaster response. They will have a job action sheet. That job action sheet clearly defines what their role is, for example, incident commander, their authority, their accountability or their chain of command, and initial steps that they should be taking to assess a situation, empower individuals around them and assign roles, and clearly define responsibilities for the rest of their team that they're working with. Checklists are critical because beyond establishing a role, responsibility, accountability, and authority, what they do is they help individuals focus. So during a disaster, everyone reacts, right? And everyone usually reacts, and it's a jolt to the system. And what a checklist does, it helps get you focused. It helps get you focused on remembering what's important and focusing on your next steps. So when a patient comes in and the patient is in cardiac arrest, one of the first things that we train our resident physicians, our students, etc., to do is check your own pulse first. And that's what a job action sheet or a checklist does. It helps us check our own pulse to get us focused on the mission at hand.
Frankly, one of the highlights of New York and in things that we've learned from the experiences in New York is that they had a robust plan on how to evacuate hospitals. You think about the size of Bellevue and NYU Langone and the number of patients that were at both hospitals, and there was a rapid requirement to do a full building evacuation. That was accomplished with no loss of life in a relatively short period of time because they did have plans in place. There was prearranged understanding of who their counterparts were across the community. So ambulance task force were already prearranged, who to reach out to, who they needed to move first, decision-making on prioritization of patient movement. Those things were already in place. It also helped a lot of us recognize plans have to potentially be a little bit more robust. You think about, some of the hazards and vulnerabilities we looked at, what happens on those events where it's a little more than what we had planned. Emergency management can't be done in a silo within a single healthcare organization. New York, like Boston, like many other metropolitan areas and in more urbanized areas in the U.S. have developed relationships not only with the other healthcare providers, who in many cases could be on a day-to-day basis for patients, their competition, but in the world of public safety and emergency preparedness, that has to go away and be a collaborative effort.
With high-rise hospitals, one of the key challenges would be in the setting of a planned event or an unplanned event, if there was a weather event, whatever it may be, to evacuate patients. So challenges would be to evacuate patients either via stairwells, elevators, etc., and have a very clear plan with those individuals. In particular, types of patients that would be challenging are patients with special needs, patients that are not able to walk, obese patients. Those types of patients require extra resources to be able to get them out of a facility, and therefore it's critical that each institution thinks about that not only right before a disaster, but in your planning phase. And institutions can plan and prepare for those events by doing tabletop exercises, functional exercises, to walk through the types of patients that they would see and to think about, with the institution and the architecture that they have, how they would be able to evacuate patients.
The factors change and have to be recognized for your community as far as evacuation times. You've got to base the criticality of your patients. There's not necessarily a one-for-one. Just because a hospital has an intensive care unit, that doesn't mean it may be able to care for the level or type of patients that are at a Brigham and Women's or a Massachusetts General Hospital, for instance, at a community hospital. The likelihood is that's not the case. So some of the more critically ill patients, those factors have to be taken into place, added into your calculations of who goes first. Do you take advantage of the fact that you have elevators to evacuate the sickest first, whereas if you, at some point in time, as they experienced in Hurricane Sandy, where they lost generators, so therefore they had no elevator power, where patients that may be able to be moved much more easily, either walk themselves down flights of stairs or be moved less in a non-ambulatory type setting, those decisions have to come into place. You need the right devices, you need the right people trained, You need the right people that are going to still provide care, because if you're coming down a high rise, that is not an easy thing to do, to go down a stairwell. It is simple as it sounds. What's the battery backup time for these devices? Once you pull the plug on them and you start going down staircases, how long is that going to take? Only so many people can go down a staircase at one time, and particularly in a patient evacuation device. How long do these devices last? Just because your generators are running, when you're doing those evacuations, as callous as it sounds, there's no extension cord made that's going to go 16 or 20 floors. And there's no way of, just going from plug to plug to plug. You're going to have to go on battery backup on these devices. Those are some of the things to weigh of who goes first. How do they go? Is it better to keep patients here and try to sustain on what limited resources we have than moving them? There is not an acute care hospital that I know of that's not going to have to make a decision. If I move this patient, they're probably going to pass. If I don't move this patient, they're probably going to pass. That's the hardest call anybody is going to have to make ever in their life. What sort of standards of care are you going to have to adjust in those sorts of circumstances? The same holds true for some sort of emerging infectious disease. What are the standards of care? Where are our resources best spent to serve people that are more likely to survive than not? Same goes in mass casualties. Again, using the incident command system, helping those decision-making goes a long way. But it's another piece is one hospital can't be making one decision about care for patient and evacuation, and the one across the street doing something different. And again, that's where the coalitions really come into play.
In Superstorm Sandy, 37 facilities transferred over 6,000 patients in preparation for the event or during the event itself. One of the key issues around those transitions or transfer of patients was when electronic health record systems went down due to loss of power. During that event, there were several hospitals that evacuated patients prior to the storm. And then there were a couple hospitals that evacuated patients during the storm. So in those two cases, in the first case, that was a planned event. There were opportunities to print out records, transition electronic health records, have communications between clinicians at each site to appropriately transition patients. In the second series, where the decision was made a little bit later to evacuate patients, where two hospitals evacuated patients, that was a bit more chaotic. Some institutions have different electronic healthcare record systems than other institutions. So some institutions cannot translate the history for patients. And many of these patients were very complicated. They're from acute care hospitals going to another acute care hospital, and it's quite challenging on caring for a patient if you don't have their history. So the bottom line is electronic healthcare records are something we rely on every day, and if you don't have that information in front of you and the power goes down, you really don't have much of anything with regard to the patient's history. The idea is to prepare and think for a planned disaster. If we have some lead time, we know that a storm is going to hit 3 to 4 days, think stepwise about what do we need to do from T-minus 4 days to T-minus 3 to T-minus 2 to ultimately the day that the storm hits. Because ultimately, again, once the storm hits, it's going to be a bit more chaotic to try to print out records and rely on some significant manipulations or adaptations right during the event. Sandy taught us a lot about physician and nursing credentialing during a disaster. There are some potentially best practices in this field, but I think we're all learning about this event. We can actually go back to events like 9/11, when an aircraft went into the Pentagon, and there was a challenge of many volunteers showing up and trying to help. So there was actually work around setting up a credentialing unit on site because there were many, many volunteers coming from EMS, fire, law enforcement, other individuals that had not identified themselves to try to credential these individuals in a short amount of time. And these are routine issues that occur on every disaster. So what we've tried to do is look at these events, and the intent is that every emergency operations plan for every healthcare system has an emergent credentialing process in place.
Can you exercise for everything? I would say not. I would say that anybody that would try to exercise for everything, to sort of paraphrase a saying, someone who tries to prepare for everything probably prepares for nothing. What you should do is focus on what your vulnerabilities are, but it also adds some confidence building to your staff. If they start feeling that, hey, I can get through this, or other things of similar nature, and recognize that it's doable, it's not overwhelming, we can do this, that's a major step forward in preparedness, is building confidence in your staff. So when you exercise something, you want to exercise something that's potentially likely could happen. Again, things that come up high in your hazard vulnerability analysis. Exercise it in a reasonable basis. That's not to say not to challenge your staff and make it easy for them, but also it gives you the opportunity to build that confidence level.
So a critical challenge for exercises, either a tabletop exercise or a functional exercise, is safety. Safety is the most important factor in any exercise that we would perform. So a challenge around doing an unannounced exercise is that we are taking care of patients. So how do we do a safe exercise while not taking away from taking care of patients? And we have worked on ways to come in to identify how many patients we have in a department or division at that given time, ensure that it's a safe time to do that exercise. So picking times where there's low volume, very few patients, low acuity, and focusing on those times. We do have opportunities during an exercise at any given time, whether it's planned or unplanned. If it's unsafe, at any time, there can be a timeout from that exercise. And certainly, if there is a real-world event, that exercise stops and we care for patients. So the priority at all times is safety and caring for patients.
We're often asked the question of how realistic these exercises should get. And that's always a good question, and you always got to start looking at the threshold that if you make it so realistic, gee, you may be putting people at risk, and you can't do that. Needless to say is, again, most hospitals, and Brigham and Women's is no exception, we're running it pretty close to capacity every day. You can't shut the power off and say, oh, let's see if we can move all the patients down the stairwells and let's see how that happens. You just can't do that. A, it's unrealistic, and B, it's really, really unsafe. So what you've got to do is set up something that allows you to do that in an environment that puts some stress on the people that are participating, but also recognizing that day-to-day healthcare still has to take place. And it adds some complexity. Sure, we like to do different types of exercises under more and more realistic conditions. Of course you would. But again, there's only so much amount of time. At the end of the day, it's delivering of quality healthcare is our mission. And taking advantage of that piece of time.
What we're doing is building a network of professionals. Professionals who have experienced events that can learn from each other and build a pool of lessons to distribute across the globe. We've learned from Boston, we've learned from Paris, we've learned from Brussels. We've done that by conducting focus groups. We've done that by conducting interviews, capturing these themes on best practices and on the opportunities for improvement. By sharing these lessons learned, we can build a network of professionals that will help each other to prepare for the next event.
Hindsight is going to be 20/20, and the day after it happens, it may be viewed as you did the absolute right thing, or you over or underreacted. That is just the nature of the business. You've got to recognize that at the end of the day, that the organization that you work for, their mission, more likely than not, and ours is no different, is providing quality health care to our patients. That means that our leaders and the leader that you'll work for, or the organization that you work for, recognize that preparing for emergencies and disasters is part of providing that quality health care.
Disaster medicine is a field that deals with the rare but high-stakes events. And through my experiences in the military and through my experiences in the civilian world, I was inspired and believe strongly that we have an obligation during these events to ensure that care provided for patients, families, and staff is of the highest quality. So regardless if it's day-to-day operations or during a disaster, our goal is to provide the safest care for patients. And I'm inspired by the stories, the experiences of others, and our team that has gone through these types of events. And that has inspired me and others to help study it, to build a science around this space, and to help care for the next patients during the next disaster.